At first light on November 29, 1864, the creek ran shallow and skinned with ice. Cheyenne and Arapaho lodges stood in a bend near Cottonwoods, Chief Black Kettle's band among them, camped where they had been told to camp, close to Fort Lyon, under letters of protection. Above Black Kettle's lodge, an American flag hung beside a white cloth. The soldiers came anyway. Colonel John M. Chivington led the Colorado 3rd Cavalry down through willows and frost. Howitzers barked, horses splashed the riffles. Some soldiers, Captain Silas Soule among them, held their companies back when they saw who stood in the sights. I will not retell the whole morning. The aftermath is its own landscape, but you cannot understand the year that followed without knowing what the fire and shouting left: burned lodges, bodies, most of them women and children, and troopers who cut and carried trophies back to Denver. Chivington called it victory. On Larimer Street, he paraded scalps. In churches, men gave thanks. The official dispatch used cleaner words: battle, hostile camp, enemy repulsed, and presented arithmetic as defense. Then the letters began to move. Soule, who had refused to fire, wrote to Major Edward Wynkoop on December 14th and called what he saw murder. Lieutenant Joseph Kramer wrote likewise, saying he had ordered his men to hold and watched little children killed. Traders testified that Black Kettle had shown his passes at Fort Lyon. Army surgeons described mutilations. These were not distant reformers. They were Colorado officers and federal employees speaking about men they knew. Territorial Governor John Evans, who had ordered the summer's roundup, friendly Indians must come to the posts or be hunted, praised Chivington's blow against hostiles. Major Scott Anthony, who had tolerated Black Kettle's nearby camp days earlier, reshaped his stance to fit his superior's report. Chivington himself wrote that women had taken up arms and that flags could not shield a hostile village. He counted bodies as if numbers could acquit. Washington opened its books. The Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War convened in the winter of 1864 to 1865. Soule testified that he refused to fire and that the camp had flown both flags. Wynkoop forwarded the letters. Doctors spoke of what their hands had measured. Traders explained the promises given at Fort Lyon. The committee's language, when it finally came, was plain. Sand Creek was not a battle. It was a massacre. Paper judgments have edges, but they cut only so deep. Chivington's term ended before the Army could court-martial him. He resigned and went east to defend himself on a lecture tour. Evans was forced from the territorial governorship. Anthony stayed in uniform a while. No officer saw a prison cell. On the plains, the punitive summer Evans had promised became the punitive winter that followed Sand Creek: raids and reprisals, freighters ambushed, ranches fired, families fled to forts, patrols rode hard and returned with stories burnished for newspapers. For Cheyenne and Arapaho survivors, the aftermath lived in bodies. Women limped from frostbite taken on the run. Children woke screaming. Bands split and fled hungry. Black Kettle, who had survived the creek under his flag, reached for peace again. In 1865, he signed at the Little Arkansas. The treaty condemned the massacre, named families for compensation, and promised annuities. In the same breath, it pushed people south and west onto poorer lands. You can apologize and dispossess in the same paragraph. The wound deepened. Denver, which had celebrated the victory, learned what testimony sounds like in a small city. Soule walked its streets after speaking under oath. On an April night in 1865, he was shot in the face at close range and died before morning. The killer escaped in the noise of parades for other war news. Soule's death read like a footnote the city added to the committee's report. We heard you, and we will not be changed. Wynkoop kept writing, heavy with the knowledge that the Army could be kinder than some men who wore its buttons. Army inspectors, late but thorough, filed reports that read like men steadying their hands. They recorded the trophies displayed in Denver, scalps, genitalia, ears, made into public property in halls and bar rooms. They named officers who had polished their stories. They set down that Black Kettle had shown passes at the post and had followed the rules written for friendly bands. The paper piled up. The dead did not rise. The men who led the assault did not face a court. What survivors saw in the months after the creek was a world in which flags meant little. They watched neighbors who had traded with them cheer as soldiers paraded trophies. They saw that the army was not a single thing, that a man like Soule could stand beside a man like Chivington in the same uniform, make another choice, and pay for it. They learned, if they had not known, that praise printed in a city can drown one honest voice unless that voice finds a courtroom. What the army wrote depended on who held the pen. One set of documents called Sand Creek and Engagement. Hostiles struck, losses inflicted, officers commended. Another, thicker set, letters, sworn statements, inspectors' notes, called it by the name the land had already given it. The first stack opened banquet doors. The second opened no doors at all, but it still stands on the shelf, dog-eared by every historian who has tried to count the cost of words. In Washington, the committee tried to make paper do moral work. It succeeded in part. Evans lost his office. The record remains. It failed in part. There was no reckoning to match the crime. Congress could condemn. It could not unspill the creek or unteach the lesson accelerated by Sand Creek along the Platte. You can be told where to camp, raise a flag, and die for believing either will matter. By autumn of 1865, the prairie was already covering what it could. Cottonwoods set a ragged new leaf. Charcoal soaked into the bend. The treaty was signed at the Little Arkansas, with promises that bent like willow in wind. The war on the Central Plains widened, and the ledger of grievance grew. Black Kettle lived on, still asking for peace, until soldiers came before dawn on the Washita in 1868. He died beneath another flag. The aftermath of Sand Creek is not simply a chapter that follows another. It is the slow weather that moves in after a storm and stays. It is policy hardened out of panic and softened by apology that does not restore what was taken. It is Soule's brief life telling us that refusing to fire is also service. It is Wincoop's careful forwarding of letters, the plain weight of a surgeon's statement, the trader's oath about a paper pass, no gun, respected. It is the sentence the committee wrote for the nation. This was a massacre. And it is the punishment the nation chose, resignations instead of trials, speeches instead of sentences, treaties that condemned the deed while moving the people who suffered it farther from their rivers. Stand at the bend now, and you will hear wind in the cottonwoods and water working its sandbars. If you arrive at first light, a meadowlark will break the quiet, and for a second you can mistake that clean sound for an ending. It is not. The creek took the name it was given and carries it still. The year after Sand Creek never really ended. It settled into memory, law, and the private weather inside families whose graves face east. Whenever a government promises safety and asks for a flag, the bend remembers. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier.